And then, which is interesting because I think the most valuable stuff is actually the Chinese art, which nobody cared. So they used most of the silk and everything to wrap the stuff up. The French stole most of the good stuff. They left. The British were kind of mad because there were actually more British soldiers, right? Remember, like it was like about 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. So not everybody got in to go to the Summer Palace, and so there were a lot of very unhappy people. So there were a lot of very unhappy people. They actually started having auctions in the Summer Palace. And there were like Muslim soldiers who would sell a piece of diamond for a bottle of wine, and they were wearing the women's clothes of the consorts, and they were dancing around fire, and then the British bought a lot of stuff from France, and then they actually from the French, and they also they had also looted in a very systematic way. So after a few days, they're mostly done, and what's quite interesting is actually there were a lot of Chinese people in between who stole things as well. And the Chinese were actually made to carry stuff. And then after selling, there was artillery where they put like different stuff that they've stolen into the cannons. And so afterwards, so what do? You've looted. You've taken Beijing. They really wanted to sign the peace treaty because at that point in time, it was already autumn. It was already October, November. And the clothes were actually relatively thin. So I think for the French, the memory was still very fresh in terms of like in 1812 when Napoleon invaded Moscow. And like in the summertime and by the autumn and wintertime, they couldn't handle the cold and went back. So they knew they had to get the peace treaty signed quickly. And so who was in charge of that? It was a guy called Lord Elgin, as in Elgin Street of Soho. So every time you go to Ouzhangao, every time like Australian Milk Company, think of Mr. Parkes that was actually kidnapped, and he was actually the main guy who negotiated the peace treaty. And whenever you go to Elgin Street in Soho, think that he was the guy who burned the Summer Palace. He actually had 3 sons as well with a Chinese woman. He took the 3 sons and went back to England, but didn't take the Chinese woman because a Chinese woman would not be fit for upper society in London. And so they were saying, okay, what do we do? We've got hostages that were kidnapped. Some of them died. Okay, this is the British side, which is we must punish them. So how do we punish them? Let's burn something. So it's like, how about this? Let's burn the Forbidden City. It's like, oh no, don't burn this Forbidden City. If you burn a Forbidden City, that is like the government, because that's where the government is, so it's official. Let's burn, because our problem is to do with the prideful king, the prideful emperor who would not see us, who would kill our hostages. So let's burn his residence. So let's burn the Summer Palace. And so that's what they did. They went in, they burned, and it was burning for 3 days and 3 nights. And then actually there were about 300 eunuchs and the court maids. They were actually, because they were trapped, so they were burned to death. And so most of the wooden stuff was actually burnt down. There were still the stones, the stone buildings and the wood and everything. Those things were actually then, in subsequent conflicts and by the local population, got ruined. So the first first of the burning did not make the Summer Palace to be as ruined as we look at it today. But that's another story. And then, so with the burning, Prince Gong was in Beijing. So he saw it and everybody was shocked. When Emperor Xianfeng, who was in Rehe, now in the autumn hunting process, when he heard it, he actually coughed blood and fell. And he became sick. That subsequently led to his death the next year. But that was actually, from the Chinese side, the reason why they burnt the palace, or the Chinese analysis, is so that we'll speed up the signing the peace treaty process, which we did. And so right after the burning, Prince Gong signed the treaty with the French and the British. So rather than giving 6 million in total to the 2 of them, it went up to 16 for both of them. And then we had Kowloon to be ceded to Britain, That's south of Boundary Street. That's why it's called Gai. It's the Boundary Street. And then opening of the ports, which we talked about, and also the well, what's a very interesting thing is then the Chinese can go in indenture, work in the Americas. That's why we have, that's why like we have all of these old Chinese stories of guys who went to build railroads in America. It's because of the Second Opium War, and it's pretty sad because the mortality rate was extremely high. And there was a lot of kidnappings of these Chinese men to go and work. And then once you're kidnapped, you might have, and then you get burnt a letter, like P. And then you put into a boat that sends you to Peru. A for America. M for Mexico. C for Canada. Like that. And so with the signing of the treaty, the French, and what's really interesting with with late Qing is that there's a huge tension between the local governments and the central government. So because simultaneously when the central government was actually signing the treaty with the French and the British, the governor of Shanghai actually asked for help of the returning soldiers of the French and British to fight against the Taiping rebellion. So we're this really weird situation, which would happen again 40 years later, in 1900, where simultaneously in Shanghai, the French and the British were helping the Qing government to put down rebellion, and at the same time, they were signing a hostile treaty with the central government. But the French and British left. The French and British left, and